In this example, I want to look at CloudFront. And the reason I want to look at CloudFront is because CloudFront offers us a solution to have SSL for our website, so encrypted traffic on our websites. So at this point, I have a domain name registered in Route53. So in Route53, I registered a domain name. So if I go to the dashboard, I can register a domain name. So let's say I wanted to register xyz.brianwitkowski.com, and I check that, and it should be available. And you can see that it is. There's an exact match. It's $14 per year, so I can choose that. So I can purchase a domain name from Amazon inside of Route53. There's other various top level domain names that I could choose, and different pricing depending on those options. But I've already registered brianwitkowski.com. So if I go to my registered domains, here's brianwitkowski.com, and when I do that, it automatically is going to give me a hosted zone, which is basically set up so that I can have it act as a DNS server for me. Within that DNS, when I set up the hosted zone, it creates two records for me. It creates a name server record, an NS record, and then it also SOA record, which is a start of authority record, which tells me basically I'm the owner and my contact information, like my email address and things like that. You'll see that I actually have 4 records here. So the 2 that I was talking about that automatically get created are right here, the name server record, so it gives the Amazon DNS servers, and then that start of authority record right there, that SOA record. I've created 2 additional records. So I've created an A record, and the A record is basically brianwitkowski.com. And if I look at this A record, it's pointing at an S3 bucket. I'll show you how to do that in a second. So the brianwitkowski.com is pointing at an S3 bucket where I have a static website that's hosting a React application. And then I have a second A record, which is a subdomain of api.brianwitkowski.com, and that's pointing at a specific IP address. And that IP address is a Linux EC2 instance that's running Apache at the moment, and all it is just the Apache splash screen. Okay, so if I go to a browser, that api.brianwitkowski.com is going to render this page right here. It's the Apache default page, and that's coming from this Apache EC2 instance. So all I did is I plugged in this public IP4 address in the A record. Okay, so over here in the A record, if I go ahead and edit this A record, or if I'm going to create an A record, that might be a better example. I would type in blog.brianwitkowski.com, and I want it to map to, let's say I want it to map to that same instance. So I copy that instance, and I go over to here. So I'm just going to type in that IP address, and it's going to route that traffic. Okay, so now I have both of those subdomains going to the same web server, and then I'd have to configure those virtual servers within the Apache configuration file, because they're both mapping to the same spot. So then it's a matter of, do I want to render the API or do I want to render the blog? Okay. brianwitkowski.com is a little bit different though, because if I go to brianwitkowski.com, that's actually pointing at an S3 bucket. So I have an S3 bucket. Okay, so this S3 bucket, I've set up the properties so that it is a static website. So if I scroll all the way down, you can see it's a static website. And then I've also set up the permissions for it to be a static website. So I'm going to allow public access. I have a bucket policy that makes all of the objects in that bucket public. And if I actually look at the objects, you can see it's a React application that's been built as a static website and then deployed out to S3. Okay, and if I look at that, it's just a simple React application. So it's got some dummy features of React, like things like that. Okay, so it's just a React application that's going to map to this S3 bucket. Okay, so at this point though, you'll notice that all of these options are not secure because I don't have SSL enabled. What I want to do is I want to enable SSL. Okay, so I want to enable SSL on this bucket. Okay, and the way I'm going to do that is with CloudFront and AWS Certificate Manager. Okay, so CloudFront and Certificate Manager are going to allow me to do that. What CloudFront is it's a content delivery network that's going to replicate my S3 bucket across the AWS data centers. Okay, and then the Certificate Manager is basically going to allow me to get an SSL certificate for my website. Okay, so let's start there by requesting a certificate. So I'm going to go ahead and request a certificate. So I'm going to request a public certificate. And the domain name that I want is brianwitkowski.com. And then I want api.brianwitkowski.com and blog.brianwitkowski.com. I'm just going to say I want all of the subdomains available with brianwitkowski.com. Okay, so that's how I'm going to handle that. I'm going to use DNS validation. And then everything else is going to stay the same. I'm just going to request the certificate. Okay, so you'll see that the certificate is requested. So here it is, and it's pending validation. Okay, so if I want to go into that certificate, the way I'm going to validate it is with DNS validation. So I can create those records in Route53. And what it's going to do is it's going to create some CNAME records for me. So if I look at Route53 right now, I have 3 A records for my domain names, and then the 2 initial records that came with my hosted zone. Okay, so if I go back over to my certificate, I'm going to say create those CNAME records in Route53. So it looks like it successfully did that. And if I go back to the certificate, now you'll see that it's still pending validation, but I should be able to refresh that. That should happen soon. If I look over in DNS and refresh this, you'll see that there's the CNAME records for my certificate. Okay, so that got created as a result of my certificate, and then me validating that certificate is what created those DNS records. Okay, so this pending validation is actually taking longer than I was thinking it would. It's usually pretty instantaneous. Okay, so it looks like it was successful. Interesting. Okay, and now it's showing as issued. So it doesn't take long for that certificate to get issued. Okay, so once I have the certificate, then I can use that certificate over in CloudFront. So I'm going to go over to CloudFront and I'm going to create a distribution. The origin domain name that I want is brianwitkowski.com. I keep typing that wrong. Okay. That all looks fine. Eventually, I get down to my web application firewall. I'm not going to use that. And then down below, here's where I can request my certificate. So I have a certificate that I just created. And then the alternate domain name, the CNAMEs, I'm going to go ahead and add those. So brianwitkowski.com. And then I'm also, I'm actually just going to use brianwitkowski.com. I don't want to use the others. I just want to use brianwitkowski.com. And I'm going to create that distribution. I didn't quite get everything that I wanted, so firewall, alternate domain name, default root object. I actually want it to be my S3 bucket, my origin domain name. So I'm going to use the website endpoint. And I had just messed up there. So the origin domain is where the content is coming from for this CloudFront distribution. So it's going to come from my S3 bucket. And then down below, where I actually get to the CNAME records, is where I'd use the brianwitkowski.com. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and create that distribution. And when I create the distribution, it's not a fast process. It does take some time. So it looks like the distribution was created, and if I look at this, it'll show as pending or deploying. I would guess that this takes approximately 10 minutes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to wait, and I will fast forward through this video while that deployment happens, and then we can come back after it's deployed. Okay, so the distribution just finished. Okay, so now I have a CloudFront distribution. And now I'm going to go back over to Route 53. And instead of pointing brianwitkowski.com at my S3 bucket, what I'm going to do is I'm going to edit that record. And when I edit the record, you'll see that right now brianwitkowski.com is pointing to an alias, which is an S3 website endpoint. What I'm going to do is I still want it to be an alias, but in this case I want it to go to a CloudFront distribution. The distribution will be there for me to select, and I can go ahead and save that. Okay, so that's just brianwitkowski.com. And then I'm just going to watch this status so I can see that DNS record get propagated. Okay, so it's pending, and it takes about 60 seconds for this to complete. And really we're doing this because before, when we were pointing it at our S3 bucket didn't have a SSL certificate associated with it. So what we did is we put CloudFront in front of our S3 bucket. That CloudFront distribution was able to attach to an SSL certificate so that we can enable SSL with regards to our S3 bucket. Okay, eventually you'll see that that status is changed for brianwitkowski.com. HTTP still should be fine. Okay, it gets me to the same spot. But now if I go to HTTPS, you'll notice that I get to the same spot, and you'll see that I'm getting site information. So I am able to connect over SSL, and now I'm not connecting to my S3 bucket directly. What I'm doing is I'm connecting to a CloudFront distribution that's in front of that bucket, and that CloudFront distribution is tied to my SSL certificate. Okay, and that does affect my hosted zone in that I have a couple of other records. So I have that CNAME record for the certificate, and then I also changed the A record to point to that CloudFront distribution. I can also, depending on what I'm trying to do, I can also set up a CloudFront distribution that would point at my EC2 instance so that I can enable a SSL key for my EC2 instance. I can also use other third-party providers like OpenSSL to set up a SSL key for my EC2 instance. But if you want an actual certificate authority like Amazon CertficateManager, then typically the way that's going to be done is I'm going to set up a CloudFront distribution. So I'd create a distribution. My origin domain name would not be my API, it would be my URL for, if I go to instances, so I have to look at my EC2 instances. Okay, so here's my EC2 instance that's running. It's an Ubuntu EC2 instance, and then I can click on that instance and get the details. So I can get that domain name, so I can copy that. And then in CloudFront, I can say I actually want it to be that EC2 instance. Okay, and then I can point that EC2 instance at a specific domain name, so like api.brianwitkowski.com or blog.brianwitkowski.com, or both, in fact. And that would allow me to then have a different distribution with a different SSL certificate, because I can only use one certificate per distribution, so I'd have to request another certificate. Okay, and the certificate, I think initially when I set up this certificate, I said that I wanted it set up as brianwitkowski.com and then star.brianwitkowski.com. I probably didn't do that correctly. If I actually want to keep this the way it is, I probably have to remove star.brianwitkowski.com, create another certificate with star.brianwitkowski.com, so all the subdomain names would be in a different certificate, and then I could use that different certificate in a different CloudFront distribution. Okay, so really this is just Route 53 in a nutshell, and then also how do I enable SSL on my static websites in an S3 bucket.